Judges, the Honorable Augustus Chin, Commissioner Kim Loon, and Michelle Oldroyd. The mock trial court, Elk River County, State of Utah, is now in session. The Honorable Judge, the Honorable Augustus Chin, is presiding.
Thank you. Please be seated. Madam Bailiff, would you please call the case?
Your Honors, today's case is State of Utah versus Lee Morgan Hatch, case number 16 CR 0987.
Lovely, thank you. Is the prosecution prepared to proceed, please?
Yes, Your Honor, we would like to introduce ourselves at this time, if that is okay with you.
Please do so, and all your witnesses as well. Thank you.
Your Honors, my name is Tana Carter. I will be directing Kennedy Price and Dr. Eli Muhammad. My co-counsel will introduce themselves.
Thank you.
Good evening, Your Honors. My name is Elijah Daly. I will be giving the prosecution opening statement and crossing defense witness Brett Anderson.
Good evening, Your Honors. My name is Joshua Christensen, and I'll be presenting the closing statement for the prosecution and cross-examining Ryan Fennell.
Your Honors, my name is Emma Ingstrom. I will be direct examining Chris Hernandez and cross-examining Lee Morgan Hatch.
Thank you.
Good evening, Your Honors. My name is Savannah Short, and I'll be portraying Kennedy Price.
Your Honors, my name is Joshua Slade, and I'll be portraying Chris Hernandez.
My name is Jackson Floyd, and I'll be portraying Dr. Eli Muhammad.
Thank you. Is the defense prepared to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. We would also like to introduce our team, if that's
Please
all
do
right.
so.
My name is Joseph Holt. I will be giving the opening statement today, as well as direct examining the defendant, Mr. Hatch, and cross-examining Dr. Muhammad.
Your Honors, my name is May Kennedy, and I'll be direct examining Ryan Fennell and cross-examining Chris Hernandez.
Your Honors, my name is Aaron Burns. I'll be direct examining Brett Anderson, cross-examining Kennedy Price, as well as giving the closing statements.
Thank you.
Hello, Your Honors. My name is Joe Kennedy, and I will be portraying Ryan Fennell.
My name is Joseph Hoffines, and I'll be portraying the part of Brett Anderson.
My name is Michael Ure, and I will be acting as the defendant, Mr. Lee Morgan Hatch.
Thank you. And we've met the bailiffs. Mr. Daly, are you prepared to give your opening statement at this time?
Yes, Your Honor.
Any housekeeping matters that we need to address ahead of time?
Our preliminary matters were taken care of by our bailiff, Your Honor.
Lovely, thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Daly.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have permission to move about the well?
Permission so granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I begin?
You may.
It was windy, dry, and hot. The perfect day for a cookout, according to the defendant, and only the defendant, Lee Morgan Hatch. Friends came, and as the night went on, the fire grew bigger than the stories told around it. That night, despite warnings from the other guests and the showers of sparks coming off the campfire, more pine was added. Meanwhile, a catastrophe was starting in Elk River, all because of a single spark, Your Honors. A single spark from Mr. Hatch's campfire. Mr. Hatch didn't even put out the campfire. It wasn't that he had no common sense. It wasn't because he didn't know fires were a risk that day. May 28th, Lee Morgan Hatch knew. He just didn't care. Your Honors, we the prosecution have brought forth the charge of causing a catastrophe today against Lee Morgan Hatch, of which two contested elements we must prove. That, one, Mr. Hatch's fire was the cause of the larger fire in Elk Creek State Park, and two, that Mr. Hatch knew his fire could and was likely to cause the catastrophe in Elk Creek State Park, or at the very least, that his fire, building and maintaining his fire, was reckless. Of the lesser offenses, we also ask Your Honors to consider the lesser included offenses of abandoning a fire and reckless burning. Later that night, our story continues. May 28th, when this dry pine brush from Mr. Hatch's yard was added, hot sparks drifted into the air towards the railroad tracks, towards the state park, towards fire's origin. And as the night wrapped up, you hear from defense witness Brett Anderson that he offered to douse the fire for the defendant, and yet he adamantly insisted that he watch it till it burns down, and didn't hold true to this statement. Instead, he went to bed. May 30th, Eli Muhammad was contacted to investigate this fire. And you hear today from Dr. Muhammad that not only was the defendant's fire within a reasonable distance to cause the fire in Elk Creek State Park, but that directional indicators he used to find the origin of the fire would literally point him to the cause, would literally point him to the defendant. Your Honors, you will learn a burning ban was in effect this day, making Lee Morgan Hatch's illegal cookout not so innocent. In fact, it wasn't his first time he's been penalized for having an illegal fire. It wasn't the first, or the second, or the third time Lee Morgan Hatch has been penalized for burning without a permit. It was, in fact, his fourth offense. We will show it wasn't that Mr. Hatch didn't know his behavior was legal. We will show he knew. He knew when the local fire department gave him his first ticket and first warning for burning without a permit. We will show he knew. He knew when he received a warning shortly after from the volunteer fire department for burning without a permit. We will show he knew. He knew when Park Ranger Chris Hernandez gave him his second ticket and third warning for what do you know? Burning without a permit. And on May 28th, he did it again. Apparently for Mr. Hatch, 3 warnings isn't enough. Your Honors, Mr. Hatch must have known. He just didn't care. Your Honors, we will show he knew. He knew his fire pit wasn't approved. He just didn't care. We will show he knew sparks were coming off his fire. He just didn't care. We will show he knew his fire never burned out and he just didn't care. We will show he knew the weather conditions were not appropriate for the fire the day of May 28th, and he just didn't care. Your Honors, we will show Lee Morgan Hatch knew he was not supposed to burn brush that night, and he just didn't care. Your Honors, there should be no reason, there will be no reasonable doubt that Hatch knowingly caused a catastrophe, or in the alternative, recklessly caused a catastrophe. I mean, how could he have not known the conditions of that day? After 3 prior warnings, how could he have not known the risk of having a fire in those conditions? And Your Honors, how could this have not have been done knowingly or recklessly? The prosecution has the answer to these questions. Lee Morgan Hatch knew. He just didn't care.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. Mr. Holt, are you prepared to give your opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed, sir.
Thank you. I also request permission to move around.
Permission so granted.
Your Honors, I trust you're familiar with the medical phenomenon of tunnel vision. It happens when a person becomes so intensely focused on an object that their field of view actually narrows, becoming telescopic. Anything outside of this field of view is essentially blacked out. Today, Your Honors, the prosecution has developed their very own special case of tunnel vision. They are very committed to the idea that my client, Lee Morgan Hatch, caused the catastrophe at the Elk Creek State Park by recklessly maintaining a fire on his property on May 28th. Unfortunately, in their passion to prove this end, the prosecution has lost sight of the overwhelming plethora of evidence that all points to one conclusion. Lee Hatch is not guilty. Today, the prosecution has the burden of proof. In order to prove their claims that Hatch caused a catastrophe, they will have to establish 2 essential elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, they will have to show that Hatch recklessly maintained his fire on May 28th, that he was improper with his behavior. Second, they will have to show that it was indeed Hatch's fire that caused the catastrophe at the park. As you carefully consider the evidence that the prosecution has frankly ignored, you will find that both of these statements are false. First, you will find that Hatch did not recklessly maintain his fire on May 28th. Hatch will come forward and testify that he built and maintained a small campfire to cook some food and celebrate Memorial Day weekend and prepare for a party that he was having on his property later that evening. You will hear from Brett Anderson, an attendee of that party, that Hatch took all reasonable precautions and kept a careful watch over his fire. You will hear Anderson describe that Hatch kept his fire small, that he kept it safe, that he kept it contained, that he never left it while it was hot. The biggest thing you will learn from the eyewitness testimony that night is that there was nothing even remarkable about Hatch's fire or his maintenance of it. Despite this fact, the prosecution will bring up 2 witnesses to talk about Hatch's fire, first being Kennedy Price. Kennedy Price will tell you that Hatch's fire was too large and that it was inadequately supervised. But you will hear from Brett Anderson that Kennedy Price actually lives with her nephew, named Dirk Miller. You will hear that Dirk Miller is known as Fireball in Elk River because of his tendency to start fires. You will hear from Mr. Ryan Fanow, an expert who examined the scene of the fire, that this very same Dirk Miller had been seen around the area of the wildfire the day that it started. Now, Your Honors, it's understandable why Ms. Kennedy Price would like to ignore the possibility that her own nephew was responsible for the catastrophe and instead focus all her blame on Hatch's campfire, but that testimony will not hold up in court. The second prosecution witness that will testify about Hatch's fire is Chris Hernandez. Hernandez is a ranger for Elk Creek State Park who will again testify that Hatch's fire is too large. But you will hear from Hernandez himself that he never actually saw the fire. Even worse, you will hear Hernandez admit that he had had some negative experiences with Hatch in the past. Now, perhaps it was this negative impression that caused Hernandez to make conclusions about a fire he hadn't even seen. But whatever the reason, that testimony is not going to prove the prosecution's first claim. But even if the prosecution could prove that Hatch had recklessly maintained his fire, they would still need to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that it was indeed his fire that caused the catastrophe at the park. As you consider the evidence, you will see that this claim is completely absurd. Mr. Ryan Fanow, the expert who examined the fire scene, will testify that it would have been physically impossible for sparks from Hatch's fire to cause the catastrophe at the park because of the directions the wind was blowing on the night of May 28th, as well as the sheer distance between Hatch's property and the point of origin. Despite this fact, the prosecution will bring forward Eli Muhammad, who will testify that Hatch's fire did start the catastrophe at the park. But you will hear from Muhammad himself during his cross-examination that he, long before he began his investigation, had developed the opinion that Hatch was reckless, unsafe, didn't have much sense, and just overall was an unsafe person. This bias caused Muhammad to focus on theories about Hatch's fire that the objective expert, Mr. Fanow, will testify are completely unsupportable. You will hear Mr. Fanow testify that, unfortunately, Mr. Muhammad's tunnel vision caused him to ignore an array of other alternative causes for the fire that are just as, if not more likely, than Lee Hatch's campfire. At the end of this trial, it will become abundantly clear, not only that Mr. Hatch was not reckless with his fire, but that it was certainly not Mr. Hatch's fire that caused the catastrophe at the park. You will see that Mr. Hatch is not guilty of causing a catastrophe, reckless burning, or abandoning a fire, and we will ask you to find him so in your ruling. Thank you, Your Honors.
Thank you, Mr. Holt. Ms. Carter, are you prepared to call your first witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution calls Kennedy Price to the stand.
Ms. Price, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right arm to the square. You do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
Yes.
You may be seated.
You may proceed.
May I have permission to move about the well?
Permission so granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please introduce yourself?
I'm Kennedy Price.
Where do you live, Ms. Price?
I live in Elk River, Utah.
So do you know the defendant, Lee Hatch?
Yes, I live next to the land he owns.
Ms. Price, have you ever seen Mr. Hatch do any work on his land?
Yes, Objection, Your Honor. This is leading the witness. She's assuming that Lee has done work on his land. But there's also
Ms. Price, have you ever seen Mr. Hatch do any work on his land?
Yes, actually, several times I've seen him burning brush. I rarely see him doing much else, actually.
Do you know if Mr. Hatch has ever had any problems with making these brush fires before?
Well, a while back, the volunteer fire department had to come and give him a warning saying that he needed a permit to burn all that stuff.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Now, why are you testifying in court today?
I went to the party on Lee Hatch's property on May 28th, 2016, and so I saw and even took a picture of the fire he built that night.
Let's talk about Mr. Hatch's behavior with the fire that he built. From what you saw, how carefully was Mr. Hatch watching the fire?
He didn't seem to be paying too much attention to it at all.
Can you give us an example of how Mr. Hatch wasn't paying attention to his fire?
Let me think of one. He didn't seem to notice how the fire was sort of jumping out of the fire ring.
Did you ever tell Mr. Hatch that the fire was jumping outside of the ring?
Oh, yes. Any ordinary person would.
And did Mr. Hatch do anything about this?
Well, not really. He kind of poked a coal back in, but that did not solve the problem.
Ms. Price, you mentioned before that you took a picture of the fire that night. Would you recognize this picture if you saw it again today?
Yes, I would.
Your Honors, at this time, we would like to refer to Exhibit 2 as it is marked in the mock trial handbook. May I approach the witness with a copy of
You may.
Exhibit 2?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Do you recognize this?
Yes.
What is it?
This is the picture I took on May 28th at the beginning of the party.
Is this a true and accurate copy of the picture?
Yes.
Your Honors, at this time, we would like to enter Exhibit 2 into evidence and ask the court to so admit it.
Ms. Burns, any objection, please?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, so admitted.
Ms. Price, will you please describe what we see in this picture?
Yes, as you can see, there's logs and branches balancing oddly on the rocks and hanging out of the fire.
How are they hanging out of the fire?
Well, they're half in and half out of the fire. Some are even touching the ground outside the fire ring.
You mentioned before that the fire was actually jumping outside of the ring that night. Can we see in the picture how that was happening?
Yes, so as you can see right here, there is the branches that are hanging out of the fire are on fire.
How big was the fire ring, Ms. Price?
It was big.
And did the fire size change throughout the night?
Well, yeah, it definitely got bigger.
Your Honors, may I approach the witness to retrieve the copy of Exhibit 2?
You have leave to approach as you see fit. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. How did the fire size change throughout the night, Ms. Price?
Well, Lee just kept adding more and more pine branches to the fire.
Did these pine branches have any effect on how the fire was behaving?
Yes, sparks were flying everywhere, especially between me and the cute boy sitting next to me.
Let's talk about the sparks in the fire in more detail. What were they caused by?
Well, when pine branches burn, the sap starts to sort of pop, sending sparks flying into the air.
From what you saw, did Mr. Hatch ever notice these sparks?
Yeah, he acted like it was really cool that the fire was sending off sparks that were shooting all over the place, like everywhere.
Finally, Ms. Price, let's talk about the fire size for a moment. Did anyone ever express concern over how big the fire was getting?
Well, of course I did. I told Lee that the fire was getting really big.
How did Mr. Hatch respond to your concerns?
He just shrugged it off.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions for the witness at this time.
Thank you. Cross-examination, please, Ms. Burns.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good evening, Ms. Price. Ms. Price, you really can't stand it when people don't respect fire, can you?
No, definitely not. Like, fire's a powerful thing.
I see. So naturally, when you arrived at a party on May 28th at La Hatch's house, you were a bit concerned. Is that correct?
Well, given the weather conditions, I was surprised that he already had a fire going, and I thought to myself, I would not feel comfortable tending to a fire like that in these conditions.
So, Ms. Price, although you wouldn't feel comfortable tending a fire that size, Lee seemed unconcerned. Is that true?
Yeah, I was very surprised.
Interesting. Now, actually, no one else seemed concerned at all. Is that correct as well?
Well, I guess they weren't being as responsible as I was in watching the fire and making sure it was
So Ms. Price, is that a yes? No one else seemed concerned?
no one expressed their concern besides me.
I see. Now, you called Lee boneheaded in his care of the fire. Is that correct?
Well, the fire was huge, and it was windy, so
So,
yes.
Ms. Price, you did say that.
Yes, I did.
But you're not much of a fan of Californians, are you?
Well, Lee seemed different, but no, I'm not a fan of Californians.
So you feel that Lee could have been more responsible in his maintenance of the fire?
Yes, definitely.
All right. Would you agree that it would be responsible to build a fire ring to hold the fire in?
Yes.
And
a proper
Lee did
fire
that.
ring.
Lee did that, didn't he?
Well, not really. He had a fire ring, but it did not contain the fire.
So Lee didn't build the fire ring?
No, he did.
Okay.
It just didn't contain the fire.
I see.
It would also probably be responsible to have poked back any escaping coals. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but it would also been responsible to make sure the fire was a reasonable size.
Okay, but Lee did poke out any escaping coals, is that correct?
Once.
Okay. It also would probably be responsible to have stomped out any escaping embers as well. Would you agree with that?
Well, it would have been responsible, yes, but he only did it once after I told him to.
Oh, so Lee did do that then?
Yes, once after I told him to.
I see. So he did all that, but nonetheless, you expressed concern to him. Is that correct?
Yes, of course. I was very nervous about the fire.
All right, and when you expressed concern, Lee made sure that his fire was contained. Is that true?
No.
So Lee did not take action to remedy your concerns?
Well, he didn't make sure the fire was contained, but he did stomp on some burning embers.
So,
and
Ms.
pull
Price,
some coals back in.
when you complained, he did take action to remedy that situation, didn't he?
Not to remedy the situation. It did not remedy. It wasn't not remedy.
So, Ms. Price, did he not take action?
He took action, but it did not remedy the problem.
Okay. Now, aside from warning Lee, did you do anything to stop this hazardous fire?
Well, besides from warning Lee, no, it wasn't my fire.
Okay, would you consider yourself a reasonable person?
Yes, just an ordinary.
All right, but you didn't do anything to stop this fire, did you?
I did.
Besides warning Lee, did you do anything?
Well, not besides warning Lee. I wasn't hosting the party. Lee was.
I see. Now, Ms. Price, after the much-anticipated cake came out, you didn't pay much more attention to the fire. Is that correct?
Well, after we made the cake, we were all sitting around, and I tried to enjoy myself, even though the fire was.
So is that a yes, Ms. Price?
Yes.
All right. In fact, you even let your concerns go. Is that true?
No, I did warn him after that.
All right. So you didn't let your concerns go then?
I warned him after that, but I stopped worrying about the fire, but my concerns never left.
All right. You made a statement at an earlier time. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. Your Honors, may I request permission to approach the witness with their affidavit?
Permission granted.
May I see what you'll be referencing? Yes, just paragraph. Do you recognize this, Ms. Price?
Yes.
And what is it?
This is my witness statement.
Is this your signature right here?
Yes.
Is it correct and accurate to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
All right. Could you please read along with me right here in paragraph 10 where it says, I let it go, and we all had some of the cake. I didn't pay too much attention to the fire. The cake was pretty tasty. Did I read that correctly, Ms. Price?
You did read it correctly.
All right, thank you, Ms. Price. Now, Ms. Price, just to be clear, you left the party because you were bored, not because of the fire. Is that true?
No.
So you didn't leave the party because you were bored?
That is one of the reasons, but that's not it. I didn't. Excuse me. You said that I didn't leave because of the fire. I did leave because of the fire, and also because I was bored. Two different reasons.
Okay, but truthfully, you were just more bored with the conversation. Is that correct?
That is another reason why I left, but I was very nervous about the fire.
So is that incorrect, what I just stated?
No, that is correct, but there were two reasons why I left, and one of them was because the fire was huge.
All right, you made a statement at an earlier time. Is that correct?
Yes.
May I again request permission to approach the witness with their statement?
Permission granted. You have leave to approach as you see fit.
Thank you, Your Honors. This is what I will show your witness. Thank you. All right, now, Ms. Price, this is the same document, but just to be sure, do you recognize this?
Yes.
All right, and is it a correct and accurate copy to the best of your knowledge?
Yes, it is.
Is this your signature right here?
Yes.
All right. Would you please read along with me right here where it says, the fire was making me nervous, but truthfully, I was more bored with the conversation and wanted to get home. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, there was two reasons why I left.
But truthfully, you were more bored and wanted to get home. Is that correct?
Yes, there was two different reasons why I left.
All right. Thank you, Your Honors. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Any redirect, Ms. Carter?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may stay there.
Thank you.
Ms. Engstrom, are you prepared to call your next witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. The prosecution calls Chris Hernandez to the stand.
Mr. Hernandez, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right arm to the square. You do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
Yes.
You may be seated.
You may proceed, Ms. Engstrom.
May I have permission to move about the bell?
Permission granted.
Please state your name for the court.
Name's Chris Hernandez.
do you do for a living, Mr. Hernandez?
I'm a park ranger, ma'am.
And what are some of your responsibilities as a park ranger?
I help enforce state regulations regarding illegal burning.
Let's talk more about these state regulations concerning illegal burning. What do these laws specifically involve?
Well, if anyone wishes to make a brush or bonfire, the state requires them to get a permit first.
And why does the state have restrictions on those type of fires?
Well, ma'am, brush and bonfires are some of the most dangerous types of fires.
Does the state do anything else to regulate fire use?
Yes, ma'am. They sometimes implement temporary fire restriction orders for several weeks at a time.
Were any of these temporary fire restriction orders issued last summer?
There were, yes.
Would you recognize a copy of this restriction order if you saw it?
I would, ma'am.
Your Honors, at this time, the prosecution would like to refer to Exhibit 1. Permission to approach the witness?
You have leave to approach as you see fit.
Do you recognize this?
Yes.
And what is it?
It is the fire restriction order issued in May.
Is it a true and accurate copy of the fire restriction order?
It is?
Your Honors, at this time, the prosecution would like to enter Exhibit 1 into evidence and ask that the court so admit it.
Ms. Kennedy, any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, so admitted.
Now, Mr. Hernandez, drawing on paragraph 2, why was this order implemented?
Well, from what I can see, the weather conditions.
Do you know specifically which weather conditions?
Well, last year the weather conditions were extremely dry.
Now, Mr. Hernandez, will you please read the last sentence of paragraph 2 out loud?
Yes. Campfires are allowed in approved fire pits only.
Will you give us an example of an approved fire pit?
Yes. Any state-designated or state-regulated campfire is a perfect example.
Thank you. Now, if you will look at the bottom of the exhibit, you will see 5 fire safety practices. Will you please read the last one?
Yes. Completely extinguish the fire when done with the activity.
Now, Mr. Hernandez, has the state had issues with campers not completely extinguishing their fires?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, it remains the primary cause for all unwanted wildland fires. Abandoning campfires is definitely a serious problem.
Thank you. Now, do you know which state, or sorry, will you tell us which states this fire restriction order was effective?
Yes, May 13th to May 31st, 2016, ma'am.
Now, does this include Memorial Day weekend?
Yes.
Specifically, does this include May 28th?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You'll hand me the exhibit. Now, Mr. Hernandez, I'd like to talk now about the wildfire that happened on May 28th. Were you working that day?
I was down at the reservoir.
And what was the weather like in Elk Creek that day?
It was extremely dry and windy, ma'am.
Now, as a park ranger, did you have any involvement with the wildfire?
I did. I helped investigate what could have been the cause.
And how did you begin your investigation?
Well, I was there at the scene of the fire and helped interview some of the witnesses at the scene of the fire. I also talked with some of my colleagues about fires that we'd seen previously that day.
After you gathered this information, what did you do next?
Well, the fire warden and I decided to go investigate Lee Hatch's property after reviewing all available information.
And what did you find at Mr. Hatch's property?
We found evidence that a large fire had been built the previous night.
Specifically, what evidence led you to the conclusion that Mr. Hatch had built a large fire?
Well, 2 things really. 1, the fact that it was still burning when we got there, and 2, the things used in the maintaining of the fire.
And what sort of things did Mr. Hatch use in his maintenance of the fire?
Well, we found evidence that logs, brush, specifically pine, and other combustibles were used in the creation of his fire.
And you mentioned that this fire was also burning when you got there. What time was that?
7 a.m. on the 29th, ma'am.
And to the extent of your knowledge, when did Mr. Hatch start this fire?
On the evening of the 28th.
Now, we previously talked about abandoned campfires and the danger that they pose. Does Mr. Hatch's behavior fit in this category?
Objection, Your Honor, this is a leading question.
Overruled.
I'll re-ask the question. We talked about abandoned campfires before. Does Mr. Hatch's actions fit under this category?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Hatch obviously did not follow the right safety precautions in properly extinguishing his fire.
Thank you. Now, have you had any previous encounters with the defendant?
Yes, actually in 2015, I had to ticket Mr. Hatch.
And what did Mr. Hatch do to receive this ticket?
He had built an illegal brush fire.
And based on the evidence you saw and the materials Mr. Hatch used, what kind of a fire did he build on May 28th?
That'd be a brush fire, ma'am.
Thank you. Your Honors, no further questions for this witness at this time.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, are you prepared to cross-examine?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Hernandez.
Good evening.
Dry weather can favor the start of a fire. Is that correct?
It can?
And just last year, a wildfire started because the weather was so dry, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you remember stating that the stars aligned in a bad way for that fire to start, right?
Yes, the weather was extremely bad.
But while the conditions last year were bad, the conditions this year were worse, weren't they?
They were, ma'am.
It was even drier than last year?
Yes.
So would you say that the stars aligned even more so for a fire to start this year, regardless of the cause?
You could say that, ma'am.
Thank you. Now, in Utah, lightning strikes cause a lot of wildfires, don't they?
They do.
And you have an uncle, Louis Hernandez, who's a notorious DNR violator, don't you?
I do.
And your uncle lives in Elk Creek.
He does.
Now, in fact, a wildfire did start on May 28th, didn't it?
It did, ma'am. Right here in Elk Creek.
And the morning after the fire, you went with the fire chief to investigate the Hatch's property, right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't investigate any other causes, did you?
Well, I reviewed all the available information, but no, not necessarily.
Thank you. Would you say you love nature, Mr. Hernandez?
Yes.
So naturally, it annoys you when people don't respect fire, right?
Well, yes, but I've got to learn with how the natural man reacts with fire, so.
And last year you had to ticket Hatch for an illegal fire, didn't you?
I did, yes.
Interesting. Now, while you were talking to Hatch, he told you that he only made a campfire, right?
He did.
Mr. Hernandez, do you need a burning permit for a campfire?
No.
Thank you. Now, you went so far as to say that Hatch was bullheaded because he made a fire on May 28th, right?
Well, I was just saying that his actions had been particularly bullheaded because of the conditions, yes.
Thank you. But earlier on the day of the 28th, you saw the smoke coming from several other campfires, right?
Yes, I was down at the reservoir.
So that means that there were others besides Hatch that were making fires on May 28th, right?
Yes, but I made sure my colleagues checked on those fires.
So as you said, you told your colleagues to check on those fires, right?
Correct.
And that's because they were concerning?
Yes.
On your way to your friend's house, you saw smoke coming from what you thought was the Hatch's property, right?
I did.
And you didn't report that smoke to your colleagues, did you?
I did not, ma'am.
As a park ranger, it is your duty to protect the environment and your fellow man. Would you agree?
It is.
So you were not doing your duty when you didn't report a potentially hazardous fire, is that right?
Well, at that time, it wouldn't be proper to go onto someone else's land without the proper authority, so no, I did not.
Thank you. Now, you were at Hatch's party that night, right?
No, I was not.
Oh, so you never even saw his fire?
I saw it the next morning.
But you didn't see any flames coming from the fire, did you?
I did not, ma'am.
And you didn't see any sparks coming from it either?
No.
Thank you. No further questions at this time, Your Honors.
Thank you. Any redirect, please, Ms. Engstrom?
Very briefly, Your Honor.
You may proceed, ma'am.
Mr. Hernandez, do you remember questions on cross about the fires you saw in the campground?
Yes,
Now, why did you not go check on those fires?
because I sent my colleagues to go check on those, and I trust my colleagues greatly.
And would it have been proper for you to go check on those fires?
No, I would have had to leave my post, and no one would have been watching the reservoir, and that would not be good.
Thank you. Let's now talk about your previous encounters with Mr. Hatch. How many times have you met Mr. Hatch?
I've met him once.
And is that it?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, let's move one more time, and let's talk this time about your investigation of Mr. Hatch's fire. You reviewed all available information before you went to his fire, am I correct?
I did, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Hernandez, how do you know that Mr. Hatch built a large fire the night of the 28th?
Because of the evidence that I found that it was still burning when I got there.
Thank you. Your Honors, no further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, any recross based on that?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Just to be clear, Mr. Hernandez, you reported those campfires you saw in the campground because you thought they were dangerous, right?
I did.
Thank you. And you're generally not a fan of people from out of state, right?
Objection, Your Honor. Asked and answered.
That's right.
Overruled.
Thank you. Would you like me to re-ask the question?
Please do.
You're generally not a fan of people from out of state, right?
No, but I can understand why they come here.
Thank you. No further questions at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Ms. Carter, you prepared for your next witness, please.
Yes, Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Eli Muhammad to the stand.
Dr. Mohammed, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right arm to the square. You do solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
Yes.
You may be seated.
You may proceed. Thank you.
May I have permission to move about the law?
Permission granted.
Thank you. Will you please introduce yourself?
My name is Dr. Eli Muhammad.
Why are you in court today, Dr. Muhammad?
I conducted an investigation in which I determined the origin and cause of the wildfire in Elk Creek State Park.
We'll talk in a moment about your investigation of the wildfire, but first let's talk about your experience with fire investigation. Do you have a curriculum vitae?
Of course.
Would you recognize this vitae if you were to see it again today?
Absolutely.
Your Honor, at this time we would like to refer to Exhibit 5 as it is marked in the mock trial handbook.
Thank you.
May I approach the witness?
You have leave to approach as you see fit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you recognize this, Dr. Muhammad?
Yes, this is my curriculum vitae.
Let's talk about the section found at the top of this document first. Will you please summarize your education?
Yes, so if we reference from the bottom up on my curriculum vitae in the education section, I got my Bachelor's of Science in Forestry, actually here in Utah, from Utah State University. My education continued at Purdue, where I got my Master's in Forest Biology and became a certified fire investigator. Then finally I got my PhD from Michigan State University.
You said that you became a certified fire investigator. What did you have to do to become certified?
I went to an international organization that offers a rigorous fire investigation certification course.
Now, Dr. Muhammad, are forest biology and civil culture, the fields in which you got your degrees, related in any way to fire investigation?
Oh yes, of course. You can't be a great forest biologist without knowledge of fire investigation and vice versa. My education has actually helped me significantly in fire investigation.
Let's now move on to your experience with fire investigation. When did you first become involved with this?
It all began back in the day when I was hired as a firefighter for the Elk River Fire Department and the Clearwater, Wisconsin Fire Department. Being a firefighter really inspired me to pursue an occupation in fire investigation.
Does your current occupation have anything to do with fire investigation?
Yes, I actually own my own wildfire consulting company for the last 9 years, and my company has provided services similar to what I'm doing in court. We primarily focus on fire investigation.
So to sum up both your experience and education in fire investigation, how many total years have you been involved with this?
39 years.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Your Honors, we would like to enter Exhibit 5 into evidence.
Any objection, Mr. Holt?
No objection to the exhibit.
Thank you, so admitted.
And at this time, Your Honor, we would also like to establish Dr. Eli Muhammad as an expert in the field of fire investigation.
Any objection, Mr. Holt?
Yes, Your Honor, just one. In order to be qualified as an expert, the expert witness needs to not have any interest in the outcome of the case. We will show in the cross-examination that Mr. Muhammad does indeed have an incredible amount of bias towards Mr. Hatch that constitutes an interest, and we would like to hold off having him entered until that point.
Do you wish to respond to that, Ms. Carter?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
Your Honors, Dr. Muhammad is a very experienced fire investigator, and as such, he knows not to let any personal opinions interfere in the way of his investigation. We will show through our direct examination that Dr. Muhammad is very cool-headed, and he is very clear and concise with his investigations. that he follows facts, not opinions.
Thank you. Your request as to a stay in the court's recognition based on biases noted, I do not find that's a valid basis to deny the request for the expert recognition, so Dr. Mohammed is so recognized as an expert in fire investigation. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Mohammed, before we go into the details of the investigation you conducted, will you please tell the court what damages occurred because of this wildfire?
Yes, based upon my investigation, I was able to conclude that over 1,800 acres were decimated by the wildfire. There are also over $6.5 million in property damage, and many people suffered from smoke inhalation and many degrees of burns.
So, Dr. Mohammed, what is your investigation of specifically the origin of the wildfire intent?
I conducted an extensive analysis in which I reviewed all available evidence, interviews, and reports, and also directional indicators to establish the location of the point of origin.
What are directional indicators?
They're simple things, really. There are patterns that are left by the wildfire, such as cupping, grass stalk patterns, charring, and damage severity that indicate the direction that the fire came from.
Let's take each of these 4 directional indicators you've told us separately. What are char patterns?
Well, if we were to take a tree, for example, the side of the tree that experiences the most heat will have a more severe charring on that side. So by examining the depth of the char pattern of the char, we can see which way the fire came from.
How does cupping help investigators find the origin?
Well, if you look at a tree stump, the side of the tree that experiences the most heat intensity will be cupped on that side, pointing in the direction that the fire came from.
You also mentioned grass stalk patterns. How do these help investigators find the origin?
As a fire burns on the grass stalks, usually burns the base first, and subsequently the grass stalks fall over. Now these grass stalks became subsequently burned by the wildfire, but some of them remain unburned. And these unburned grass stalks point in the direction that the fire came from.
The final directional indicator you told us is damage severity. How does damage severity help investigators like yourself find the origin of the wildfire?
Oh, by examining the extent of the damage and how severe the damage gets, I can tell I'm getting closer to the point of origin. As the fire dies out, there's less damage, there's less severe damage.
Dr. Mohammed, how definitive are these indicators?
While it's true that some of these indicators may be incorrect themselves, when they're all cohesive with each other and point in the exact same direction like they did in this case, it's practically impossible for them to be incorrect.
So did the directional indicators in this case lead you to find the origin of the wildfire?
Yes, they did.
And where did you determine the point of origin to be, Dr. Mohammed?
The point of origin is in an open field near the railroad tracks further east of Mr. Hatch's property.
Is there any evidence that would aid you in explaining where the origin is located?
Yes, the map that Chris Hernandez drew, while it's not drawn to scale, would work excellently as demonstrative evidence.
Your Honors, at this time we would like to refer to Exhibit 2 as is marked in the mock trial handbook.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, excuse me, Exhibit 4. My mistake.
Not at all. Thank you.
Do you recognize this document, or excuse me, this map?
Yes, this is the map that Chris Hernandez drew.
And is it a true and accurate copy of that map?
Yes, I believe so.
Your Honors, at this time we would like to enter Exhibit 4 into evidence and ask the court to so admit it.
Any objection, Mr. Holt?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. So admitted.
Your Honors, now that this smaller copy of the map has been admitted, we would like to bring forth an enlarged copy for the benefit of the court.
Thank you.
Dr. Mohammed, in comparing these two exhibits, the smaller and the larger one, are they identical in every way except for size?
Yes, I believe so.
So now that you have the map with you, will you please re-explain to the court where the origin is located?
Yes, so on the map it's labeled point of origin with that little fire symbol right there. It's in the open field to the east of the railroad tracks and further east of Hatch's property.
So Dr. Mohammed, now that you knew where the origin was, did you automatically know why or how the wildfire started?
No, identifying the point of origin is only the first step in determining the wildfire, and then how to determine how it started.
Does knowing the point of origin impact the possibilities of what could have started the wildfire?
Yes, it significantly narrows down the list of possibilities.
Was this the case in your investigation of Elk River?
Yes, once I determined the point of origin, several possibilities became irrelevant.
What were these possibilities, Dr. Mohammed?
There were four main possibilities. the grass fire on the east side of the reservoir, the campfires at the campground, the kids playing around the railroad tracks, and Mr. Hatch's fire.
How were you able to rule some of these 4 possibilities out?
Well, the first two, the grass fire and the fires at the campground, I was able to rule automatically based upon where the location, the point of origin is, and the direction of the wind.
What direction was the wind blowing on May 28th and 29th?
If we reference the map, the wind was blowing from the west towards the east.
How do you know the wind was blowing from the west towards the east?
Well, I determined the wind was blowing in that direction based upon the directional indicators and the spread of the fire.
Why would the spread of the fire tell you which direction the wind was going?
Well, the fire moves in the direction that the wind is blowing. Now, in this case, the fire went from the point of origin, east, and then down south along the side of the reservoir, showing that the wind was indeed moving towards the east.
So why were you able to rule out the grass fire because of where the origin is located and the direction of the wind?
Well, the grass fire is on the east side of the reservoir, so any burning material from the grass fire would have to cross the large body of water and that great distance to land at the point of origin while traveling against the wind, which is scientifically impossible.
And why were you able to rule out the fires located at the campground?
For the same reasons as the grass fire, the fires at the campground cannot travel against the wind.
Dr. Muhammad, we are now down to 2 possibilities. Will you remind us what these 2 things are?
Yes, kids playing around the railroad tracks and Mr. Hatch's fire.
Let's address the first of these possibilities. Could the kids playing at the railroad tracks have started the wildfire?
No, based upon my investigation, that scenario is impossible.
Why would this scenario be impossible?
Well, of course, I talked to these kids, I talked to the people that saw them there, and there was no evidence of them having any cigarettes, lighters, flares, or any other combustibles.
And while talking to these kids, Dr. Muhammad, did you really trust them to tell the truth?
Well, part of being a fire investigator is knowing how to ask the right questions. I've had a lot of experience interviewing witnesses, and I kind of know how to make people squirm based on the questions I ask, and this especially works on teenagers. So after I poked them around a little bit, I could tell that they didn't have the means to cause the fire.
Dr. Muhammad, we have now arrived at the last possibility. Will you remind us what this final possibility is?
Yes, Mr. Hatch's fire.
Now, understanding that Mr. Hatch had a fire on his property on May 28th, do you know where any sparks from his fire would have been blown?
Yes, based upon the direction the wind was blowing east, any sparks from Hatch's fire would have landed directly at the point of origin.
How do you know the distance from Mr. Hatch's fire to the point of origin was short enough for the scenario to happen?
Well, considering the hot, dry, and windy conditions, it's not that great of a distance at all. And plus, I walked around that area. It's definitely possible for a spark to have been the cause.
Dr. Muhammad, let's end with the heart of the matter. In your expert opinion, what is the cause of the wildfire at Elk River State Park?
Mr. Hatch's campfire was the cause.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Your Honor. I have no further questions for the witness at this time.
Thank you. Are you prepared to cross-examine, Mr. Goff?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Mohammed, how are you today?
Fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good, sir.
So you know the defendant, Lee Hatch, don't you?
Yes, he's an acquaintance.
You knew him long before you began your investigation, is that correct?
I knew him because he was a neighbor to my parents, yes.
Okay, so he was your neighbor when you lived in Elk River, right?
He was a neighbor to my parents.
So he wasn't your neighbor?
Now, I lived in Elk River, and I was a firefighter there in 1978, and I'm not sure if Hatch was in the area back in that time.
But Hatch lived next to your parents, is that correct?
Yes, that is true.
Okay. So you don't think that Hatch has ever had much sense, do you?
You know, to be honest, I mean, Hatch has made some reckless decisions, and yeah, it's true.
Okay, and you believe that Hatch is a reckless person, is that correct?
I know, I would not deem him a reckless person, but his actions have been reckless in the past, and especially the maintenance of his campfire on the 28th.
So you don't believe he's reckless?
I believe that his actions are reckless.
You believe he's been reckless for as long as you've known him, is that correct?
That is what I said in my affidavit. I haven't known him that long now.
Okay, so are you saying that you don't believe he's reckless?
No, his actions are reckless, and therefore I concluded that based upon his actions, he's been reckless.
So you do believe he's a reckless person?
Sure, yes.
Okay. Now, in fact, you actually referred to the defendant as, quote, reckless Hatch in your affidavit, is that correct?
I did.
Okay. Now, when you referred to him as such, you were talking about the fire that he built at his party on May 28th, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
And you were able to conclude that this fire was recklessly maintained?
Yes, obviously.
And you were there and saw the fire?
No, actually, I was not there. I was contacted on the 30th to investigate the fire.
I see. So you weren't present at the party?
No, but I was able to review the photo Kennedy Price
So,
took of the
Mr.
campfire.
Muhammad, did you ever see Hatch maintaining his fire?
I did not. But based
Okay.
upon all available evidence, interviews, and reports, I concluded that his actions were reckless.
So just to be clear, you never saw him maintaining that fire?
I did not see him maintain
Okay.
the fire on the 28th.
Now, Mr. Muhammad, the point of origin, according to your investigation, was just east of the railroad tracks, just east of Mr. Hatch's property, is that correct?
Yes.
It was in an open field?
Yes.
Okay, what's the difference between an open field and a forest?
It's a pretty logical conclusion. I mean, open field wouldn't be surrounded by many trees, which especially makes it more plausible that Hatch's fire was the cause
I see.
because it wouldn't have to dodge many obstacles.
Certainly, Mr. Muhammad. So the difference between an open field is that it doesn't have trees in it, and a forested area does.
Now, there were trees in that open field, but there were not as many trees
Sure.
as there would be in an overgrown forest.
This field is open, and so it doesn't have as many trees as the forested area outside of it.
Yes, that is true.
I see. Now, let's talk about the directional indicators you used for a moment to find the origin. There was cupping, stock patterns, and char patterns, is that correct?
Yeah, there are those three, and also damage to
And,
building.
and also damage severity. Thank you.
Yes.
So let's talk about cupping for a moment. Cupping is a mark left on a tree, is that correct?
Yes, when the fire burns the tree, it creates a cup sign on the tree to indicate that the fire came from that direction.
And similarly, char patterns are also marks left on trees.
Yes.
So you need trees to use those directional indicators.
Yes, so what's really fascinating, though, is at the point of origin,
So, Mr. Muhammad, just to be clear, you can certainly address any questions you may want to ask in redirect, but just to be clear, that those directional indicators are used by looking at trees.
they can also be used in stumps or other small brushes, but it's most easy to identify them based upon trees, yes.
Okay. Now, stock patterns are the other directional indicator, one of the other directional indicators you mentioned. They have to do with grass, is that correct?
True.
Now, stock patterns are not reliable on their own, are they?
When they are cohesive with all of the other directional indicators, they are reliable.
Right, but you would never use stock patterns as their own directional indicator just by themselves.
No, that would not be a full investigation. I tried to conduct a thorough investigation.
So in the open field where there weren't trees, the only directional indicator you had to use was stock patterns. Is that correct?
No, that is not true. So what's really fascinating is at the point of origin, there are contradictory directional indicators.
Certainly,
Now-
but seeing as there weren't very many trees, you couldn't really use cupping and you couldn't really use char patterns, right?
No, that's not true.
So you could use cupping and char patterns without looking at trees?
No, not without looking at trees, but by looking at the trees, I can see that there's cupping and char
In the
patterns.
middle of the open field?
Not in the middle of the open field, but in the open field.
So at the point of origin, let's just make this clear. At the point of origin, where it's in the middle of an open field, you were able to look at trees and determine that there was cupping and char patterns.
Not 100%, but I did see that there were contradictory directional indicators to establish that the point of origin was
Mr.
there. Now, when I
Mr.
looked at
Muhammad,
the
we'll
trees in
move
the
on.
campground, they
Certainly
all
you can
pointed
address
to
anything in your
that.
direct examination. We'll just go ahead and move on. Okay,
Yes, Mr. Holt.
let's talk about the winds that you investigated in your investigation. You determined that the wind was coming from the west.
Yes,
correct?
west moving towards the east.
And this is because the fire burned in an easterly direction, generally. Is that
Yes.
true? Okay. Now let's talk about the winds that you talked about. Did you investigate diurnal winds in your investigation?
I did not specifically use those in this case.
Okay, and did you investigate fire winds in your investigation?
Well, fire winds were part of determining the way the fire spread, and the fire spread from the east, from the point of origin east.
So, Mr. Muhammad, any part of the fire spread would be relevant to the fire, is that correct?
Excuse me?
Any part of the fire spread, any factor in the fire spread would be relevant to that fire, is that correct?
Yes, that is true.
And you
But diurnal
investigated that
winds,
fire?
excuse me, Mr. Holt, diurnal winds did not play a part in this case.
I see. And any factor that would be, you were told to include all relevant and pertinent information in your affidavit, is that correct?
Yes.
So, fire winds being a factor in helping the spread of the fire, did you investigate those fire winds?
No, they were not relevant in this case, that's why I did not include them in my affidavit.
I see. Now, you conducted a thorough investigation of the wildfire, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you investigated other potential causes of the wildfire as part of that thorough investigation?
Indeed.
Okay, so you looked for lightning strikes in the area of the fire?
There was no evidence of lightning strikes.
So you did look for evidence?
Well, It'd be pretty hard to see the evidence of lightning strikes due to the fact that the fire decimated the majority of the area.
So just to be clear, you did not rule out lightning strikes as a possible cause,
No, I did rule them out.
but you couldn't find any evidence of them?
That's exactly why I ruled them out.
But it wouldn't be, but just, so you just barely said that it would be extremely difficult to find any evidence of lightning strikes?
Due to
Is
the
that true?
fact that the whole campground was decimated, yes.
I see. Now, you also mentioned a grass fire burning to the east of the reservoir on the same day the wildfire started, didn't you?
Yes.
Now, that grass fire was, you talked to some to the fire chief about that grass fire, didn't you?
I talked to some of the firefighters.
Okay, and you ruled that out as a cause?
Not just because I talked with them, but based upon where the origin is and the direction of the wind. I was able
Certainly.
to rule it
And
out.
you investigated the scene of that grass fire as well?
There was no need, I did not.
Oh, so you didn't.
I did not investigate
Okay.
the scene of the grass fire.
Now, you also investigated the potential cause of kids that were seen playing around the railroad tracks, is that correct?
Yes.
And you went to talk to those kids and you asked them if they had any flammable materials, is that correct?
Yes, if they had any cigarettes, lighters, or flares, or
Certainly.
other combustibles.
And you talked to others who were in the area who might have seen them, right?
Yes, of course.
And they said they didn't see them.
Yes.
And so then you stopped your investigation?
Well, no, not my complete investigation, no.
Of those kids, of that alternate cause, pardon me. You
Yes,
stopped your
so-
investigation of that alternate cause.
They could not have been the cause. I mean, like I talked about in direct, I know how to ask the right questions. I could tell that they did not have the means to cause the wildfire. And even if they did cause the wildfire, the point of origin would be directly on the railroad track, seeing as that's where they were seen.
So Mr.
hanging
Muhammad,
around.
just to be clear, you ruled out the possibility that those kids had started the fire just based on your examining them and the fact that nobody else had seen them in the area.
And the fact that if they did cause the fire, the point of origin would be on the railroad tracks.
Now, Mr. Muhammad, do you think that it's possible that there could have been some point throughout the day where someone wasn't watching those kids?
Well, I believe that all the kids were watching each other, and I talked to them, and I made sure, based upon my investigation, that they were telling the truth.
So let's just be clear. There could have been some point during the day when someone wasn't watching those kids. Is that correct?
Yes, and there could have been a point when Hatch wasn't watching his fire.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Muhammad. But seeing as there was a point where someone may not have been watching those kids, could there have been a point where they wandered off away from the tracks a bit? Is that a physical possibility?
Well, I would have to speculate a lot more than relying on cold, hard facts and scientific conclusions.
Mr. Muhammad,
But
I'm not asking you what happened. I'm just asking you if it would be possible for that to happen.
that is a possibility.
Okay. And if they did that, would it be possible for one of those kids to pull a cigarette out of their pants and drop it in the dry grass?
Objection, Your Honor, speculation. While Dr. Muhammad is an experienced fire investigator, he is not a teenager, and so he should not be asked to testify about what those teenagers could have done.
May I
You wish to
respond?
respond, Mr. Hall?
Certainly, Your Honor. I'm not asking Mr. Muhammad to speculate about the facts of the case or to testify or to guess about any facts. I'm simply asking if this scenario is possible, not if it happened.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Muhammad, would it be possible in that scenario for one of those kids to pull a cigarette out of their pants and drop it in the dry grass?
That is a possibility.
Okay.
But
Now,
not
when
the
you
facts of this
when
case.
you asked those kids whether they had started the fire, do you think it's possible that they could have lied to you?
No, I've had a lot of practice interviewing witnesses, and I do not believe that's possible.
So you believe it's completely impossible that they could have lied?
Well, no, I mean, teenagers do lie, but I've had a lot of experience, reading body language and, ensuring that they did not lie.
I see. Now, we'll go ahead and move on. Did you ask any of the stores in the area if sales had been made of flammable items to those kids?
No, I did not.
Did you talk to those kids' parents?
I'm not aware of who the parents were, no.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Any redirect, please?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Proceed.
Dr. Muhammad, when did you start your investigation of Mr. Hatch's fire?
I began my investigation after I determined the point of origin and examined other possible causes.
So you had already determined that the point of origin was located in that open field before you even heard of Mr. Hatch's fire?
Yes, exactly.
Now, Dr. Muhammad, let's talk about the directional indicators you've used in comparison to the origin of the point of origin of the wildfire. Did the wildfire ever spread through forested areas?
Yes, of course.
So did you read directional indicators from those forested areas?
Yes, and these directional indicators pointed to the northwest, which they pointed exactly to the point of origin.
Is there any of the directional indicators that you used that you specifically were able to tell the open
Your
field?
Honor, this question is the leading question. The attorney is suggesting the answer.
Ms. Carter,
I can reword my question, Your Honor.
sustained. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Do you use any directional indicators specifically in that open field?
Yes, well, I took all the knowledge from the directional indicators that were, further away from the point of origin, and grass stalk patterns also played a role.
Can you remind us of the 4 directional indicators that you used?
Yes, I used cupping, charring, grass stalk patterns, and damage severity.
So with damage severity, where exactly do you find the damage severity as a directional indicator?
So, as the fire burns out, the damage becomes less severe. Therefore, by following where there's more severe damage, I can pinpoint that I'm getting closer.
Objection, Your Honor. I never asked the witness anything about damage severity as a directional indicator, so asking him about that fact is beyond the scope of the cross-examination.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
I believe that Mr. Holt did in fact ask my witness. He mentioned the fact that damage severity was one of the directional indicators that Dr. Muhammad used in his investigation.
And I believe the beyond the scope objection is relevant only if the recross is and the redirect are not in focus. So objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Dr. Muhammad, my question was, where, so the damage severity, were you able to use that at the point of origin?
Yes, the damage was more severe at the point of origin because that is where the wildfire started.
Now, going to the other possibilities that could have caused the fire, how come you didn't investigate specifically the scene of the grass fire?
Well, it's scientifically impossible for that to have been the cause. I wanted to ensure that I conducted a thorough investigation of the other probable causes.
And why do you think this is scientifically impossible?
Well, based upon the location that the point of origin is, and the direction of the wind, any burning material from a grass fire cannot have traveled against the wind to start the wildfire.
Will you remind us what direction the wind was going that night?
It was blowing from the west towards the east.
Now, Dr. Muhammad, moving on to the kids from the railroad tracks, where were they at, and where did people spot them at?
I don't know the exact location where on the railroad tracks they were, but I know that they were hanging around the railroad tracks and other people saw them there.
And where was the point of origin?
The point of origin was east of the railroad tracks.
So it was not at the railroad tracks.
No, the point of origin was not at the railroad tracks.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Thank you, Your Honors. I have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Any recross based on that you redirect?
No, Your Honor, not at this time.
Thank you. You may step down. Ms. Carter, anything further from the prosecution?
No, Your Honor. The prosecution rests.
Thank you. With respect to the defense's case in chief, do you wish to have a 5-minute recess and then begin your case in chief? Do you have any housekeeping matters you wish to address?
Your Honor, we would be fine with the 5-minute recess. We're ready to move on.
Thank you. We'll take a 5-minute recess.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Ms. Kennedy, is the defense prepared to call the first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to call Ryan Fennell to the stand.
Mr. Fennell, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
I do.
You may be seated.
Thank you.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Please state your name for the benefit of the court.
My name is Ryan Fennell.
What do you do for a living, Mr. Fennell?
I'm actually the president of Forensic Consultants Incorporated. Not to advertise here, but we consult in just about everything from products liability to property damage and personal injury. My specific set of skills leans more towards fire investigation.
What makes you qualified to analyze wildfires?
Well, I've been doing it for 40 years now, so to be honest, I have quite a bit of experience under my belt. I have a curriculum vitae which details my education career further than we have time for.
Would you recognize a copy of this vitae if I were to show it to you?
Yes, I would.
Your Honors, I request permission to approach the witness with his vitae, which has been marked as Exhibit 6.
Permission granted. You have leave to approach as you see fit.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, do you recognize this, Mr. Purnell?
Yes.
And what is it?
My curriculum vitae.
Is it correct and accurate to your best of your knowledge?
Yes.
And is it current?
Of course.
Who wrote this vitae, Mr. Purnell?
I wrote it myself.
Thank you. Your Honors, I request that this be entered into evidence as Exhibit 6.
Thank you. Any objection, Mr. Christensen?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, so admitted.
Thank you. Now, can you explain for us the contents under the paragraph marked education?
I received a bachelor's from Everest College and a master's from the University of Phoenix, both of which were in electrical engineering. I have obtained an MBA. I'm a certified professional engineer in 6 states. I am also a certified safety professional and a certified fire and explosion investigator.
Thank you. And what about the paragraph marked experience?
Well, as I stated earlier, I've been at this for 40 years now. I started out working as an engineer before I found my true passion of investigating fires. I was hired in 1975 to do just that, and from there I was entrusted with positions of vice president, then president, and the rest is history.
Thank you. Your Honors, I request that Mr. Purnell be entered as an expert in fire investigation as well as fire safety.
Fire investigations and
Fire safety, Your Honor.
fire safety. Any objection, Mr. Christensen?
Yes, Your Honor, the prosecution objects on lack of foundation.
Can I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
Your Honor, seeing as we've gone over his 40 years of experience and his multiple degrees in all of his fire investigation, I don't believe this is lack of foundation.
What foundational lacking is there in your opinion?
Your Honor, we request that opposing counsel lay more foundation as to this expert witness's education in this particular field. They have established that he had an education, but they haven't established the relevance of his education and how this would be pertinent to fire investigation or fire safety.
You're referring to actual work experience.
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you wish to respond briefly, Ms. Kennedy?
Yes, Your Honor, seeing as he has received certified fire investigation and fire safety, he's perfectly qualified, and we've already gone over this.
Given the certification, given the background that's been identified, your objection is noted, Mr. Christensen. Mr. Fennell will be recognized as a fire investigation expert and a fire safety expert. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. How did you become involved with this case, Mr. Fennell?
Shortly after the fire, I was hired to investigate 2 main issues,
And what issues are those?
namely whether or not Hatch's campfire started the wildfire, and also whether or not Hatch was reckless in his maintenance of his fire. My personal research found the answer to both questions to be no.
So how did you begin your investigation?
Well, I started out by trying to define an exact origin of the fire.
What can you tell us about the origin of the fire?
You know, if there's a map, I would love to show you on there. It could greatly add to clarity.
Your Honors, may I refer to our enlarged version of Exhibit 4?
You may.
And for the clarity of the court, would you like the witness to approach the map on our stand, or would you like me to bring the map to him?
I leave it for you to make that determination.
All right, Mr. Fennell, would you please leave the witness stand?
Of course.
Map is right there. Now, what can you tell us about the origin of this fire?
Well, the prosecution points to this open field directly to the east of Hatch's property as the origin of the fire, but I found they were a bit too narrow-minded there.
Where else could the fire have originated?
The also likely, and in my opinion, the actual provenance of the fire is to the north-northeast. The prosecution failed to notice directional indicators that show the fire coming from the northeast and down into this prairie.
Objection, Your Honor, creating material facts not found in the evidence.
Your Honor, Your Honor?
Please.
Your Honor, it says in his affidavit the very thing you just stated.
Your Honor's may respond.
Please.
As he's using a map that is not drawn to scale, it's been stipulated in the handbook that this map is not drawn to scale. He's using this map to point out a specific place of origin. It does mention that his fire was to the north-northeast. However, it does not mention where, and so the witness pointing to any spot on this map would be indeed creating material fact.
Do you agree with what Ms. Kennedy stated, that there is such a reference in his affidavit?
Yes, it is certainly referenced that it is towards the general north-northeast direction.
Then we're just splitting hairs at this point, Mr. Christensen. Your objection is overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you like me to, well, Your Honor, we'll finish, so we'll move on.
Thank you.
Why do the fire powders fit the prosecution's origin as well, Mr. Fennell?
And that has to do with the type of fuel that is being burned. So at the origin of the fire, it will often appear that it's burning in multiple directions while it finds a real course to follow. The reason that the prosecution's point of origin has this multiple direction sign is actually because it's a field of grass. And at that location, the fire was fluctuated more easily by the different winds that were blowing.
What type of winds were blowing in this fire?
There were actually 3. meteorological, which are relatively constant, coming from certain directions at certain times of year. Diurnal winds, which occur around bodies of water. It's almost like the water breathes in and out during the day because of heat changes. And then, of course, fire winds are generated by the heat of the fire and push it along at unprecedented rates.
Which wind was the most important factor in this fire?
I would have to say that the fire wind was actually the most important. That appears to be the case because the fire burned towards the south, thus towards where the other winds were coming from.
Why did the fire winds overpower the other winds?
The terrain of a fire can cause this to occur. You see, unlike humans, fires actually travel easier uphill. And the hilly Elk River can easily make this occur. And so the fire winds overpowered the other winds until it was fluctuated and twisted a bit in that open field.
And what direction was the wind blowing, Mr. Todd?
Well, the wind actually was coming from several different directions depending on the time of day and whether or not the diurnal winds and the fire winds and the meteorological winds were affecting the fire at certain times. So it may appear at times that the wind is coming from the west, but there's actually multiple directions.
So can you walk us through the spread of this fire?
So the fire originated up here to the north-northeast and came down into this open field where it was swayed by the different winds that were blowing, and then it came down into the campgrounds a bit more directly. And I believe that's all I had to
Mr.
share.
Christensen, if you need to see the map where he's pointing to, you're welcome to get up, or we can have him turn the map so you can also get a view of what he's directing on the map.
Yes, Your Honor.
Would you like me to turn the map then?
Would you turn the map
Yes,
slightly?
absolutely.
You
So
can
it's-
just adjust the easel and just turn the map slightly so that Mr. Christensen can get a view as well. Thank you.
Is that all right? Okay. So the fire originated up here to the northeast and spread down into this open field where it was twisted around a bit and then went into the campground more directly from there. Is that sufficient for you?
Thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to show us on the map?
I believe that's all I had to show you actually. So,
May the witness return to the witness stand, Your Honor.
Absolutely. Thank you.
thank you.
Now, Mr. Fernell, can you tell us why you reached the conclusion that Hatch's campfire did not start the wildfire in May 28th?
Actually, for two reasons. First of all, the prosecution says that the source was sparks or embers coming off of the campfire. That's impossible because those small sparks, even call them sparkles, they don't have the heat intensity or the longevity to start fires in other locations.
And what's the second reason?
Well, I've been investigating fires in the West now for 40 years, and in late May, the meteorological winds are coming from the southeast. With the diurnal winds and the time of day taken into account, they would have been shifted to be coming from the southwest. But how then could an ember be blown directly to the east? The distance alone makes this unlikely.
So what else, in your expert opinion, could have been the cause of this wildfire?
An option that hasn't been explored enough is the possibility that kids were playing around the railroad tracks and started the fire. Apparently they hang out there smoking and drinking, and they could have started this fire.
Were the kids seen there the day of the wildfire?
Yes, actually they were seen there, and when I explored the site that they hang out, I found beer cans, and so they definitely need to be researched into very, very carefully.
Are there any other alternative causes to this fire?
Lightning is a major option that could be viable. An estimated 70% of wildfires in the West are caused by lightning, and when I reviewed meteorological
Objection, Your Honor,
data,
hearsay.
You wish to respond, Ms. Kennedy?
Yes, Your Honor, seeing as he's not directly quoting anybody, doesn't matter, say.
Your Honor's may be heard. He was citing a particular study that was an out-of-court statement, and they're offering it evidence to prove the truth of the matter, sir.
I have no
That's not
response, Your Honor.
correct. It doesn't have to be a statement in order for it to be determined hearsay. Do you wish to respond?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Sustain.
Yes, Your Honor. We'll move on. One last question for you, Mr. Fernell. In your opinion, was Hatch reckless in starting and maintaining his campfire?
no, Hatch was not reckless at all. I mean, he built the fire in a clear location surrounded by green grass, and according to him, he watched it until it was almost out. There was nothing improper, and it is my expert opinion that Hatch's campfire could not have started the wildfire at Elk Creek State Park.
Thank you. No further questions for this witness at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Christensen, are you prepared to cross-examine, please?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed, sir.
May I walk about the well?
You have permission to move about the well.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Mr. Fennell.
Hello.
Let's get started. You have a curriculum vitae,
Yes, I do.
and you would recognize this vitae if you're to see the court today, right?
Yes.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness with a copy of Exhibit 6?
Permission granted. And you have leave to approach as you see fit.
What is this document?
This is my curriculum vitae.
And is it a true and accurate copy of your curriculum vitae?
Here's the second page. Yes, now it is.
Thank you.
Objection, Your Honor. This attorney has not shown me this copy of the VK. He's showing my witness.
Thank you.
I'll be referring to the exhibit as well.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Fennell, let's talk about your educational experience. You graduated from Everest College,
Yes, I did.
and that was in 1956.
Yes, that's correct, with my bachelor's degree.
So that was about 61 years ago. And while you were at Everest College, you got your bachelor's of engineering and electrical engineering, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And after you graduated from Everest College, you continued your educational experience at the University of Phoenix.
Yes.
And at the University of Phoenix, you got your master's of engineering and electrical engineering.
Yes.
After you attended the University of Phoenix, you attended DeVry University.
Yes, it was, yes, for my MBA.
Yes, and that's where you got your master's of business administration.
Yes, of course.
And after you attended DeVry University, you attended D Safety School.
And that was actually before DeVry, technically, since I had to get that before my time. Pardon me, actually.
But Mr. Fennell, you did attend D Safety School, right?
Yes, I did attend D Safety School.
And at D Safety School, you became a certified safety professional.
Yes, it was a privilege to go to D's.
And at D Safety School, you became a certified explosion and fire investigator, right?
A fire and explosion investigator is what we typically refer to it as, but yes.
And now, Mr. Fennell, I have a couple more questions for you. Have you ever received a degree from Utah State University?
No.
Have you ever received a degree from Purdue University?
I consider it a privilege that I have not.
Objection, Your Honor. Relevance.
Mr. Christensen?
This testimony is being elicited to go to the weight of the credibility of the witness. On direct examination, opposing counsel did the exact same thing. They talked about his education to establish his credibility. The prosecution is simply doing the same.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
No, I don't see why it's necessary to bring up all of the schools he did not receive a degree from.
Objection is noted. It's overruled. You may
Yes, Your Honor.
continue.
Have you ever received a degree from Purdue University?
No.
Have you ever received a degree from Michigan State University?
No, I have not.
And Mr. Fennell, were you aware that Dr. Mohammed has degrees from these educational institutions?
Yes, I was.
Now, Mr. Fennell, do you have a bachelor's in forestry?
No.
Do you have a master's in forest biology?
No, I do not.
And do you have a PhD in silviculture?
I didn't have time to go back for a PhD. I was too busy investigating all those wildfires.
So that would be no.
Yes, that would be no.
And Mr. Fennell, you're aware that Dr. Mohammed has degrees in these things?
Objection,
Yeah.
Your Honor. This attorney cannot question this witness about something another witness has said. It's against mock trial.
Mr. Christensen, do you wish to respond?
Yes, it's true that the witnesses are soon sequestered. I'm not asking him to testify as to what other witnesses have said in court today. I'm just asking if he was aware that Dr. Mohammed had.
You're just comparing their experience and background?
Yes.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Mr. Fennell, were you aware that Dr. Mohammed had degrees in these fields?
Honestly, it seems to me that he spent a lot of time in the classroom and less time out doing the stuff that I've
Mr.
been doing.
Fennell, were you aware that Dr. Mohammed?
Yes, I was aware.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Now, it's true that you published articles, right?
Yes, I have.
And the recent publications on your recent publication section of your curriculum vitae, your two most recent publications, they're about fire investigation.
Yes, that is correct.
Can you please follow along with me as I read the last article of that section?
Of course.
Does anyone out there, do aliens really exist? An examination of electrical evidence. UFOs, aliens, and other explained phenomena quarterly.
Objection, Your Honor. This is improper character testimony, seeing as this attorney is trying to prove with this that my witness is an idiot.
Mr. Christensen?
Your Honor, again, this goes to the credibility of the witness's testimony.
I'm not convinced it's an improper character testimony at this time. Objection is noted and it's overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
I'll start from the beginning.
Yes, go
if
ahead.
that's okay. Is anyone out there? Do aliens really exist? An examination of electrical evidence, UFOs, aliens, and other explained phenomena quarterly, fall 2012. Did I read that correctly?
Except that it's unexplained phenomena, but I don't like that magazine too much anyway, so, yes.
Did I read that correctly, though, Mr. Fennell?
Almost, but yes, I'll say yes.
Now, it's true that you were retained by attorneys for Lee Morgan Hatch, right?
That is correct?
And you were asked to answer two very simple questions.
Yes,
First being whether or not Mr. Hatch was the cause of the fire,
yes,
and the second being whether or not his behavior was reckless.
those are the questions.
And you answered both questions with, as you put it, a resounding no.
Yes, no.
Now, Mr. Fennell, shouldn't you make $450 an hour?
For consulting, that's true.
And you make $750 an hour for testifying in court.
That's correct.
So to be clear, you're actually being paid money right now.
When you work, you get money, that's correct.
And that money is going to come from those attorneys over there, right?
Yes,
The counsel for the defense.
yes, but also that does not vary my pay. I just want to say that I'm not biased,
But, Mr.
as the
Fennell,
attorney is trying to
That money is
say.
going to come from defense counsel, right?
Yes,
It's true that in total, Mr. Hatch's attorneys have been billed $34,397, right?
for me and my associates, that's how much they are paying us.
That's not including the money that you're going to be paid at the end of this trial, right?
Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Now, you investigated the cause of the fire, right?
that's correct.
And let's talk about your investigation. You started your investigation a week after the fire.
About a week, a little bit less actually.
Okay. And you determined that multiple other things, besides Mr. Hatch, of course, could have started the fire at Green State Park, right?
That is what I found.
You concluded that lightning could have caused the fire?
Yes,
But, Mr. Fennell, of course, you found evidence of a lightning strike in the general area.
I actually did not check every single tree, and the damage of the fire does make it very difficult to find evidence of a lightning strike.
Mr. Fennell, so you found no evidence of a lightning strike in the general area?
Well, there were storm conditions passing through the area, although, no, I didn't find an exact lightning bolt.
So, to be clear, you did not find any specific evidence of a lightning strike in the general area?
That actually is a direct quote, almost, from my witness statement. So that's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. You also concluded that kids playing around the railroad tracks could have caused a fire.
Those kids nowadays, always a danger.
You did conclude that kids playing on the railroad tracks could have caused a fire?
Yes, if that's,
Mr. Fennell, of course, you interviewed these supposed offenders.
I did in fact. And I also interviewed witnesses who saw them.
Your Honors, at this time I'd like to approach the witness with a copy of their affidavit.
Permission granted.
What paragraph will we be referring to?
I'll not be referring to a specific paragraph, but this statement. May I approach the witness?
You have leave to approach as you see fit, Mr. Chris.
Thank you. Mr. Fennell, can you please point out where in your affidavit it states that you interviewed kids playing on the railroad tracks or any witnesses?
Let's see, there's a statement here. Some kids were seen there earlier in the day. I had to interview witnesses in order to find that information.
But you must have forgotten to mention that in your affidavit, right?
Forgot to mention that. Do you want me to express everything
Please point-
explicitly?
Mr. Fennell, can you please point out specifically where it states that
If I were to say everything that I do in order to research all of this affidavit would be much longer. I did not put that exact phrase in this statement, no.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell.
Here, here's that back.
So, Mr. Fennell, you did not interview these supposed offenders?
I did, in fact, interview them, although I did not put the statement directly in there, although it is indirectly in there.
Mr. Fennell, you found other evidence that this scenario could have happened, right?
Excuse me, what do
You
you
found other evidence that this scenario could have happened?
Well, yes, the fire could have originated in that location.
You heard rumors that kids like to play under the trestle.
And I
Objection,
did
Your Honor,
statements.
this is a hearsay question. He's talking about rumors and we don't know the source of those.
No specificity is being mentioned over.
So you heard rumors that kids like to play around under the trestle, right?
Actually, beyond even rumors, I found beer cans. I believe I stated that earlier.
But Mr. Fennell, you never saw the kids under the trestle yourself, right?
I'm afraid I was up in Washington State where I live while they were under the trestle.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. No further questions for this witness.
Thank you. Any redirect, please?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Mr. Fennell, how does electrical engineering affect fire investigation?
It actually has a pivotal role in fire investigation. And with electrical engineering, I started out working as an engineer, and in houses and buildings, fires will actually start from electricity. So that sparked my interest, you could say, in investigating fires, and that's what led me to fire investigation.
And what is Dee's Safety School?
Dee's Safety School is a very renowned institution, actually. James Dee was perhaps the most famous fire investigator in the 20th century, and I was privileged to graduate from a rigorous school in safety and fire investigation.
And can you relist for us your education, your pursuits, and what you've earned?
Yes, bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering, although no, they were not from Purdue or Michigan University. I also received training in safety professionalism, and also fire and explosion investigation.
And how many years of experience do you have?
Over almost 42 now. It's getting even more as I speak.
Now, in the cross-examination, you were asked about your paper on aliens. Can you explain for us that paper?
Yes, that paper was actually very fun to write. Seeing as I have a lot of background in electricity, I researched and found that aliens actually do not exist. Evidently, the prosecution has not read the paper, but through scientific evidence, I proved that aliens cannot exist, and it's a very fascinating read, I think.
Mr. Fennell, does your pay vary depending on how you testified here today?
An expert's pay should be a package deal. I'm paid to testify for a minimum of 1 day, and I think that's very important. It proves that an expert witness is not biased.
Now let's move to May 28th and your investigation of that wildfire that day. Were there storm conditions on that day?
There were storm conditions that I found passing through the area.
And was there a possibility that a lightning strike could have come from those storm conditions and started this wildfire?
An estimated 70% of wildfires in the West are caused by lightning. Thus, it is very, very possible that a lightning strike
Objection, Your Honor.
started this fire.
Your Honor, we'll move on.
Sustained.
And can you please tell us how you found that kids were playing by the railroad tracks on that day?
As I said, I spoke to people who had seen them, just like I'm guessing Dr. Mohammed did in order to conduct his thorough investigation.
Thank you. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any recross based on that redirect, Mr. Christensen?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Ms. Burns, are you prepared to call your next witness, please?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense would like to call Brett Anderson to the stand.
Mr. Anderson, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
Yes.
You may be seated.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Anderson, would you please state your full name for the benefit of the court?
Yes, my name is Brett Anderson.
And where do you live?
I live in Elk River, Utah in an apartment above Anderson's Hardware.
Where do you work, Mr. Anderson?
I work in Anderson's Hardware.
Were you working on May 28th?
Yes, I was. In fact, that was the day that Rami came and invited me to his cookout, or a cookout at his uncle's house.
How did you respond to this invitation?
I wasn't super excited to go.
Why was that?
You see, ever since Lee moved back to California, he's kind of been on a back to nature kick, and he's not afraid to tell you about it. It can get a little annoying after a time, but we all know Lee's heart's in the right place, so we don't give him a hard time.
So what did you decide to do, Mr. Anderson?
We did decide to go to the party. We knew we'd get an earful from Lee, but Lee's actually cooked over a fire a lot and has gotten really good at it. So we went mainly for the food.
Did anything worth noting happen before the party?
Yeah, actually, on our way over, we heard what sounded like gunshots or fireworks.
Did this surprise you?
See, in Elk River, it's not surprising to hear gunshots. I mean, Louis is always shooting at something. However, we did see some smoke off to the east, and that was a bit concerning.
Why was that concerning?
You see, in that direction are the railroad tracks, and crews clear brush from off the tracks and pile it.
Objection, Your Honor, lack of personal knowledge.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
This witness is testifying to something that occurs, at least he's heard of that occurs, in a general area where he lives. He's allowed to testify to what he knows.
But does he have personal knowledge?
Yes, Your Honor. Because he lives in that area, he's aware of those situations.
Living in an area and having some awareness does not establish personal knowledge unless you have direct knowledge, being physically present in observations. His objection is sustained.
We'll move on, Your Honors. So, do you know of anybody by the name of Dirk Miller?
Yes, I know Dirk Miller.
What do you know about this Dirk Miller?
Well, he's actually kind of notorious in Elk River for starting those piles on fire. He was, well, his nickname around Elk River is actually literally Fireball.
Objection, Your Honor, improper character testimony.
May I respond? Thank you, Your Honor.
So like I said, his nickname is literally Fireball in Elk River. He actually was arrested last fall for starting fires.
Objection, Your Honor, this is hearsay.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Please.
I don't believe the witness made any statement about a statement that he heard or an out-of-court statement at all.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please, briefly.
In this witness affidavit, they say, I heard he was arrested for starting fires in garbage cans.
May I respond, Your Honor, briefly? As we've established before, because there's no specificity to that statement, it's not hearsay.
Overruled. You may continue.
Yeah, he was arrested last fall for starting fires in store dumpsters.
Are there any other fires that you know of that Dirk Miller started?
Yeah, he's actually started the railroad crews' piles that they clear off the tracks on fire.
Have you had any recent interaction with Dirk Miller?
Yes, he was actually in my store, Anderson's Hardware, on Wednesday or Thursday trying to buy some emergency flares.
Did you sell him those flares?
Yes. Well, I didn't sell them to Dirk that day. I sold them to his Aunt Kenny Price, who came in after him and bought emergency flares and black powder.
To the best of your knowledge, had Kennedy Price ever bought those items before?
That was the odd thing. I checked back into books because it's state law that we make sure we know who buys these things. And Kennedy had never bought black powder or flares before. She had no idea even what kind of black powder she wanted.
Now let's get back to the party. What was it like when you got there?
When we got to the party, there was a small cooking fire, but somebody was attending it all times.
Did anyone seem uncomfortable with this fire to you?
No. Well, Kennedy Price seemed nervous, but she always seems paranoid around fire for some reason.
Did Kennedy say anything?
Yes. At one point during the party, she said, "Watch that dang fire of yours," but she didn't say dang. It was totally uncalled for and out of place.
Was there any reason that you could discern at the party for Kennedy to be worried about?
The party? No. I mean, well, she does live with Dirk Miller, and that would make anybody a little nervous.
When the party was over, was the fire put out?
I offered to douse the fire for Lee, but he said he would stay up with it and watch it burn down.
What time did you leave this party?
I left around 10 or 11.
Did anything worth noting happen after the party?
Yeah, actually, as we were driving home, the sky was still glowing from a fire. I thought it was odd that the grass fire that we saw on the way over was still burning.
Based off what you've seen, Mr. Anderson, did the fire at Lee Hatch's house cause the fire at Elk Creek State Park?
To me, it's physically impossible. There's no possible way that Lee's fire started.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
I was not suggesting that the witness had an expert opinion, merely asking him for his opinion based off the facts that he's seen.
Sustained.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Thank you. Cross-examination, please, Mr. Daly.
Yes, Your Honor. May I have permission to move about the road?
Permission granted.
Thank you. Mr. Anderson, I'd like to start by talking about May 28th, 2016.
Okay.
Earlier in that day, it had been windy, correct?
There was a little bit of wind that day.
And it had been windy and very hot.
What?
And it had been windy and very hot.
Not unusual for Elk River, but yeah.
And later that night, you went to the defendant's home, correct?
Yes, that's where the party was.
And at the defendant's home, there was a fire.
Yes, we had a small green fire.
Now you said you saw Lee Hatch put some pine branches on that fire.
Yeah, to keep it going.
These pine branches that he had cleared from his land.
Objection, Your Honor. Argumentative. These aren't questions, they're statements.
Overruled.
Well, you see, why would he go buy firewood when he already had some on his land that he needed to get rid of?
Is that a yes, Mr. Anderson?
Yeah, of course.
Now these pine branches, when they were added to the fire reacted to this pine, isn't that right?
When they were out of the fire?
When the pine was added to the fire,
Added.
the fire reacted to this pine.
Yeah, of course, they caught on fire.
It sent out some hot sparks.
All fires do, yeah.
The wind actually carried these hot sparks from the fire, correct?
The wind did lift the sparks, yeah.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion. He's not an expert in this situation or this field.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please, Mr. Hall.
The witness in his affidavit states that he saw the sparks drift off. Leave the hot sparks left the fire throughout the night.
And the question does not ask for any expertise or an opinion as to what was caused as a result. So, objection is overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Your Honor. So these sparks, hot sparks were carried into the air, correct?
They went into the air and then went out.
Mr. Anderson, you saw them go out?
Yes, they turned to black.
Mr. Anderson, you made a statement at an earlier time, correct?
Yes, I did.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness with his affidavit?
Absolutely. Would you please show to opposing counsel what you are referring to?
I will be referring to the affidavit as a whole. Mr. Anderson.
You have leave to approach as you see fit as well.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Anderson, is this a true and accurate copy of your affidavit?
Let's see.
Is this your signature?
Yes, that is.
Now, Mr. Anderson, can you show me here where you say in your statement, not I'm sure the sparks went out or anything assuming. Can you tell me where you saw the sparks physically go out?
Here we are. Sure, the wind carried away some hot sparks, but I'm sure they were dead before they hit the ground.
Mr. Anderson, did you testify in that statement that you saw the sparks go out?
Yes, I'm sure they went out.
You are sure they went out? You did not see them go out?
Yes, I did.
You were asked to include all relative information into your affidavit, correct?
Yes.
And I'm sure does not mean I saw. Isn't that right?
I'm saying what I saw, and I'm sure they went out.
Objection, Your Honor. Creating material fact not found in the record.
Do you wish to respond, Ms. Barnes?
Yes, Your Honor. The witness has clearly stated that he's sure means that he saw them go out. How else could he know besides seeing them?
Objection noted and overruled.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Anderson, these sparks drifted towards the railroad tracks, isn't that right?
Yes, they did.
And the railroad tracks are to the east.
Yes, they are.
So the sparks were drifting east towards the railroad tracks.
Yes, the dead sparks.
Now, Mr. Anderson, I would like to go back to earlier that night.
Okay.
Lee Morgan Hatch demonstrated the proper way to use a brush hook, correct?
Yes, he did.
And he uses this brush hook to clear brush from his land.
Yes, so it doesn't become a fire hazard. That's what a brush hook is used for.
Now, Mr. Anderson, just to be clear, if a fire is fed with brush, it's clearly a brush fire, correct?
If it's not a fire.
Objection, Your Honor. Improper opinion. He's not an expert on what is or isn't a brush fire, so he can't testify to this.
Overruled.
I'll restate my question.
Okay.
Now, if a fire is fed with brush, it's clearly a brush fire, correct?
Well, the thing is, the brush was inside a fire pit, and so thus it was a campfire.
But the pine branches, the brush that he had cleared from his land, was continually fed to the fire, correct?
Brush or pine branches, those are two different things.
It was, the pine branches, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
were continually fed to the fire. Isn't that right?
Yes, we put pine wood on fire.
Now, I'd like to talk about later that night.
Okay?
Later that night, you offered to douse the fire for the defendant, correct?
Yeah, I did.
And he said he wanted to watch it till it burns down. Is that correct?
Yes, he said he would stay up till it went down.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. Anderson. We have no further questions for this witness at this time.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. Could you tell us about Lee's maintenance of his fire?
Yes, it was very great. He made sure somebody was watching the fire at all times. He even told Rami to go check on the sparks at one point.
Interesting. And based on what you saw, was Lee Hatch's fire, a campfire or a brush fire?
It was obviously a campfire.
Thank you, Your Honors. No further questions.
Thank you. Any recross based on that redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Mr. Holt, are you prepared to call your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor, we would like to call Mr. Hatch to the stand.
Mr. Hatch, please step forward and take the oath.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in this mock trial?
Yes, I do.
You may be seated.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Mr. Hatch. How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
Could you please state your full name for the benefit of the court?
My name is Lee Morgan Hatch.
And how old are you?
I'm 34 years old.
Where do you live?
I live in California, but I own some beautiful land out in Elk River, Utah, and I like to think that whenever I leave to go back to California, my heart stays in my home, Elk River, Utah.
So how big is that property that you own?
You know, it's decently big. I'd say it's about 5 acres, maybe a little more, but probably about 5 acres.
Okay, and do you have any trees on that property?
Yeah, it's largely grass, but right around the perimeter there is a lot of dense, thick foliage and trees, large pine trees actually.
So, Mr. Hatch, why are you here today?
You know, sadly, some of the Elk River authorities feel that I am responsible for the wildfire that occurred on May 28, 2016 in Elk River, Utah.
What were you doing on the evening of May 28th?
You know, it was a beautiful day in Elk River, Utah. It was also Memorial Day weekend, and I was in for the weekend, and I decided to have a party with some of my friends to enjoy the environment and to eat some delicious food.
So, did you have a fire during this party?
Yes, I did. I had a small fire, and I made sure to keep that fire within all fire regulations.
So, what fire regulations are you aware of?
I'm aware that certain fires require burning permits to burn them, and certain fires do not require burning permits.
How did you figure that out?
Well, when I was new to having my own property in Elk River, Utah, I had been burning some brush on my property outside of a fire pit, and I found that in order to have a brush fire, you need to have a burning permit.
So, what is a brush fire, Mr. Hatch, to the best of your knowledge?
A brush fire is when you clear brush off of your property and then you burn it outside of a fire pit for the purpose
Objection,
of clearing
Your
your
Honor.
property.
This is improper opinion.
Mr. Holt?
Your Honor, if it takes an expert to identify what a brush fire is and is not, then I don't see why we would be punishing for Mr. Hatch for burning a brush fire.
Objection noted and is overruled.
So, to the best of your knowledge, what is a brush fire, Mr. Hatch?
To the best of my knowledge and what the park ranger said is that if you clear brush off your property and then you burn it outside of the fire
Objection,
pit.
Your Honor. Hearsay.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Please.
The witness is not testifying as to a statement made by any park ranger or Chris Hernandez. He's simply testifying to his knowledge about brush fires and how he learned that
But
knowledge.
that's not how he framed his answer that I just heard. He's making reference to a statement that was made, he was told. Objection is sustained.
Mr. Hatch, what did you understand a brush fire to be?
In my understanding, a brush fire is when you clear brush off of your property, burn it outside of a fire pit for the purpose of clearing your property and taking care of unwanted brush.
So when you burned your brush fire a couple of years ago, did you get a ticket for that?
Yes, I did. I believe my ticket was roughly $200, but you know, I felt that was a noteworthy price to pay for the safety of Elk River.
Okay, so let's talk about your party a little bit. What kind of fire did you have on your party on May 28th?
I had a campfire.
And how did this fire follow regulations?
Well, this fire followed regulations first because it was on my property, and then second because it was in a fire pit. And I know for certain from checking on the DNR website that as long as your fire is on your property and then in a fire pit, you can always have a fire regardless of the
Okay, so how big was that campfire that you had?
Well, you know, Elk River in previous years has had problems with wildfires, and so whenever I start a fire, I do my best to be conscientious of that and make it as small and safe as possible. So this fire was a small fire.
So what precautions did you take to keep this fire safe?
Well, aside from keeping it small, I made sure to keep watch and contain any coals or sparks, and then I also made sure to keep an eye on the fire, and I took every reasonable precaution that I would normally when taking care of a fire.
You mentioned some sparks. Could you explain these a little bit for us?
Yes, I have pine on my property, and so when I burn a fire, or when I have fires, I generally end up using pine as a wood source. And pine does have sparks associated with it, however, they're really not more significantly dangerous than a stereotypical fire.
Okay, so did anybody seem concerned about your fire at your party?
No. Not that I can think of. I would hope, and it seemed to me that everybody in my party really enjoyed the party.
So what did you do after you started your fire?
After I started my fire, you know, I really enjoyed spending time with my family. I enjoyed being in Elk River, Utah. We lived out the duration of the party. Actually, towards the evening, we noticed that there was what seemed to be a fire burning off to the east.
Okay, so how close did this fire seem to you?
This fire seemed to be more towards the other side of the reservoir, and my friends confirmed me that there had been a grass fire up there earlier, and so it seemed to be on the other side of the reservoir.
So did the fire seem close to your property?
No, I would not say the fire seemed relatively close to my property, but it did seem relatively close to Elk River as it may have been approaching Elk River on the other side of the reservoir.
Okay, so what happened after you noticed that other fire?
Well, we assumed that the fire had been dealt with. We heard fire nearby, and then we lived out the rest of the party. We had a great time, or I would assume we had a great time. And then, yeah, the party ended shortly after that.
Now, Mr. Hatch, did you go inside at that point after the party ended?
No, I did not. I actually went to sleep by my fire.
I see. So you never went inside?
No, I never went inside.
Do you think that you acted recklessly in maintaining your fire?
You know, I absolutely do not feel that I acted recklessly in maintaining my fire. And if I had acted recklessly, and if I felt that I acted recklessly, I would be more than happy to pay any fine, or even to do jail time if necessary, because I truly love Elk River, and I do not feel that I'm responsible for this fire at all.
Thank you, Mr. Hatch. And thank you, Your Honor. We have no further questions at this time.
Thank you. Cross-examination, please, Ms. Exford.
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
May I have permission to move about the will and approach the witness as they need?
Permission granted for both.
Mr. Hatch, you received a fine from the fire department a few years back.
Yes, I did.
Let's go through specifically what you did to receive this fine. Now, that day, you were, as usual, clearing brush on your land.
That is correct.
And you specifically cleared branches.
Yes, I cleared branches and brush off my property.
And then you put these branches in a pile and burned them. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you were fined for burning the small pile of branches without a permit.
And that is correct.
Now, before you got this fine, you did not know that this was a problem.
Before I had no idea that was a problem.
After you got this fine, you knew that it was illegal for you to burn even a small pile of branches without a permit.
Yes, and I actually checked on the DNR website. As long as that pile of branches is outside of a fire pit or
Mr. Hatch,
on state property, not my own property.
was that correct? That you needed a permit to burn small pile of branches?
Right, if it was either on state property or not in a fire pit, for sure.
Thank you. Now, you know, sorry, let's move on now to talk about what you did on May 28th. On May 28th, you were again clearing your land?
Yeah, I was really in the day. I was.
And you again specifically cleared branches?
Yes, again, I specifically cleared branches.
Now, you had a fire later that evening,
I did.
and you put these branches in your fire.
Yes, I did, because
So to be
it was,
clear, Mr. Hatch, you did burn these branches that you cleared from your land.
Mr. Attorney, as I've already stated, as long as I have it on my property in a fire pit, I am welcome to burn those branches. And because, I mean, if they were to impose this regulation, and then would I be responsible for going off my property and finding branches or material that I could burn away from my land? That would be amazing.
Thank you. Now, from this experience, you learned that the town sometimes issues burning bans,
That is correct, yes.
and they issue these burning bans when the weather is poor.
And yes, that's correct.
But you did not think there were any burning bans on during the month of May.
No, I didn't think that there were any burning bans
Now-
on during the May, and I didn't feel it was necessary
Mr.
because
Hatch.
regardless of whether or not there's a burning ban, as long as the fire's on my property in a fire pit, I can still have a fire.
Mr. Hatch, I'm asking you pretty simple questions. Will you please answer just those?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Now, you based your belief that there were no burning bans, you based this belief on what you remembered of the Department of Natural Resources website.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
You know that you thought there were no burning bans on during the month of May because of what you saw on the Department of Natural Resources website?
I wouldn't say necessarily the burning bans in May. I would say that was coupled with my research to the
So
DNR.
you didn't know, you didn't learn that there were no burning bans on May because of the DNR website?
I'm sorry, you lost me with that question.
Let me rephrase. Are you saying that you did not learn that there were no burning bans on May? You did not learn that from the DNR website?
I learned that partially from the DNR website, but I mean, I looked at the DNR website in January, and then after I found out that I can always have it on my property, I didn't feel it was really relevant or pertinent. And really, you can't really tell whether there's going to be a burning ban in May in January.
Exactly, Mr. Hatch.
Partially.
You could not tell that there was going to be a burning ban in May when you checked the website in January.
That is correct, but the website specifically said that it didn't matter as long as the fire was on my property.
Now, Mr. Hatch, you said in your affidavit that as long as my fire was, you said just because my fire wasn't in a designated, actually, you know what, I'm just gonna read it. Please, I need this. I will be referring to paragraph 9. And will you follow along to make sure I read this correct, please?
Absolutely.
I know from looking at the DNR website in January that I can always
Objection, Your
have a
Honor.
fire.
We would like the attorney to go ahead and confirm that that is a
Oh.
correct and accurate copy with my witness.
My
before she asks
apologies.
questions about it.
Do you recognize this?
Yep, yes I do.
Is it a true and accurate copy of your witness affidavit?
As far as I can see, yes.
And is this your signature?
Sure is.
Now, will you follow along as I read in paragraph 9?
So if we could just scoot that just a little bit closer, thank you.
I know from looking at the DNR website in January that I can always have a campfire. And just because my fire wasn't at a designated campsite and was in the middle of my property, in a special rock ring I created to make fires in, I figured it's all the same thing. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Now, Mr. Hatch, a fire in a designated campsite and a fire in someone's backyard are not the same thing, are they?
Well, yeah, and I do think that that's true because specifically designated campsites are specifically zoned out for state park
So,
campgrounds.
is that a
not
yes,
necessarily
Mr.
property.
Hatch?
Yeah, that is a yes.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about the weather on May 28th.
Absolutely.
The weather started out fine, didn't it? On May
The day
28th.
of May 28th? Yeah.
But then the wind picked up,
It got windy towards the afternoon, absolutely.
and there were clouds to the west.
Yes, there were.
There was even a wildfire already burning across the reservoir.
There was a grass fire burning across the reservoir, and I actually found out about that later as the party progressed. That was not.
So later that evening, you could, to be clear, later that evening, you could see a grass fire burning.
Yeah, later in the evening, we noticed a grass fire, or a fire, off to the east, which seemed to be on the other side of Redson.
Now that night you had your own fire, Mr. Hatch,
Yes, I did.
and you started this fire just to have one going.
No.
You did not start
I
this
started the
just
fire
to have
before
one
my
going?
party, just to have one going while I worked, and then when I actually started the fire at my party.
So did you start your fire twice?
No, so it was virtually the same party, but the sole purpose that I started was not simply to have one going, it was for the purpose of my party. I started one, so in my affidavit I record saying, I started the fire just to have one going because it keeps the mosquitoes out away and it makes the working conditions more desirable. And then that fire also carried into the park that night. But no, it was not my specific intent just to have a fire going. That's
Okay. And again, this is the same copy, but do you recognize this?
Ms. Ekstrom, did you wish to show opposing counsel what you've been referring to?
Sure.
Thank you.
It will be on this page.
Thanks.
You're referring to paragraph 12. Will you follow along as I read this? I
Excuse
finished
me, Your
the-
Honors. The prosecution has exceeded their time for cross.
I know. Can I finish reading this really quick? Or do I be done?
Your time is up.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. Any redirect, please?
Yes, Your Honor, but first could I go ahead and confer with my bailiff on time?
You may proceed.
Thank you. All right, Mr. Hatch, let's start off by talking about brush fires. What is the difference between a brush fire and a campfire, according to your knowledge?
So specifically, the difference between a brush fire and a campfire is when you have cleared the brush off your property for the purpose of getting rid of the brush and then burned it outside of a campfire or a fire pit, I should say.
So if brush that you cleared from your property is inside of a fire ring, is it a brush fire?
Yeah, so absolutely not, because if they were to say, you know, if I had to go outside of my property to get wood, that would be majorly impinging on upon my rights. Maybe for a state grounds campfire, but on my own property, I'm absolutely permitted to use combustibles off my property.
Okay. Now, did you have a brush fire or a campfire for your party on May 28th?
And a campfire for my property on May 28th.
Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about the DNR website. What did you do regarding the DNR website in January?
Right, so after I got ticketed, I wanted to make sure that I was within regulations. I got on the DNR website and I made sure to find out when I could and could not have a fire. And I found that as long as it was on my property and in a fire pit, I can always have a fire, regardless of burning bans or anything else.
So as far as you know, were you operating within the bounds of the law when you had a fire on May 28th?
Yeah, undoubtedly, I absolutely was.
Okay, now let's talk about the weather, the windiness on May 28th in the evening. Did the windiness impede your ability to maintain a safe fire?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. Elk River is frequently windy, and no, absolutely not.
Okay. All right, Your Honor, we have no further questions.
Thank you. And recross, would you care to check if you have time for recross?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down. Anything further? Mr. Holt?
Your Honor, the defense rests. We're ready to move on.
Thank you. For the parties, and I do note, Mr. Christensen, you're doing the closing argument for the prosecution, and Ms. Burns, you are likewise doing closing argument for the defense. Would you like 5 or a 7-minute recess before resuming the closing argument?
Your Honor, 5-minute recess would be adequate.
5 would be sufficient here as well.
Thank you. We'll take a 5-minute recess.
All rise.
Thank you. Please be seated. Mr. Christensen, are you prepared to give closing argument, please, sir?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Before I begin, may I reserve any remaining time for rebuttal?
Certainly.
And may I move about what?
Permission granted.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may, sir.
It was hot, it was dry, it was windy. And despite what the defendant and only the defendant thought, May 28th was by no means the perfect day for a cookout. Ignoring the incredibly dangerous weather conditions and the warnings from friends, Mr. Hatch knowingly started a fire that became larger than the stories told around him. It wasn't that Mr. Hatch didn't have any common sense. It wasn't that he was oblivious to the risks of having a fire on May 28th. And it wasn't that he didn't see many sparks, even embers rising from his fire into the sky. As Mr. Hatch knew, he just didn't care. Today, the prosecution was burdened to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that 1, Mr. Hatch caused the fire, and 2, that he did so knowingly. The prosecution has met their burden of proof on both elements of the law. Dr. Mohammed is an expert with 39 years of experience in actual fire investigation. He is the president of Wildfire Consulting Services and has a prestigious educational background. He reviewed all evidence, interviews, and reports, and it's his expert opinion that Mr. Hatch caused the fire. But Your Honors, we also heard from another expert today, Ryan Fanow. We heard how Ryan Fanow did not investigate, but investigated third-party possibilities. Mr. Fanow claimed that lightning could have caused the fire, yet he never found any specific evidence of a lightning strike. Mr. Fanow claimed that kids playing on the railroad tracks could have caused the fire, yet he never interviewed the supposed offenders, and his investigation was limited to rumors he heard in beer cans he saw. Mr. Fanow claimed that other campers' fires could have caused the fire, but Your Honors, the wind was coming from the west, making that impossible. And Mr. Fanow claimed that the fire to the east side of the reservoir could have caused the fire. Your Honors, that fire was out long before the fire in Creek State Park ever even started. Your Honors, facts are stubborn things, and it seems that Mr. Fanow was much more comfortable to investigate his way around the inconvenient facts rather than to investigate what actually happened. After all, he did have 34,397 reasons to do so. But Your Honors, under scrutiny, the defense's claims become just as fictitious as the aliens in his flying saucer. But there was one area where both experts had to agree. Even Mr. Fanow couldn't deny that Mr. Hatch's behavior was reckless. Mr. Hatch himself knew his behavior was reckless, as it was his 4th offense for burning without a permit. We heard from Kennedy Price that Mr. Hatch was warned by the volunteer fire department for burning without a permit. We heard from Lee Morgan Hatch that he was ticketed 2 years ago for burning without a permit, this time by the fire department. And we heard from Chris Hernandez. Just last year, Mr. Hatch was ticketed yet again for burning without a permit, this time by the Department of Natural Resources. Despite all this, when Mr. Hernandez went on to Mr. Hatch's property the next day, he saw brush still burning from an unauthorized fire in an unauthorized fire ring. Mr. Hatch knew he just didn't care. Now, in a few moments, the defense is going to have the opportunity to present their closing statement, and we, the prosecution, have 3 questions for them. Written them down on this piece of paper right here. First, how can Mr. Hatch have not known the conditions of May 28th? After 3 prior warnings, how could he have not known the risk of having a fire in these conditions? And how could he have not done this knowingly, or at least recklessly? Now, Your Honors, I'm going to leave this paper right here on this witness stand, because that's where they remained unasked and unanswered. And when the defense gets up here in a few moments and is unable to answer those 3 questions, we ask that you find Lee Morgan Hatch guilty of causing a catastrophe or of the lesser included offenses. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Burns, are you prepared to give your closing?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Permission to move about the well, Your Honor.
Permission granted.
Thank you. When a person becomes too intensely focused on a single point, they can experience a phenomenon known as tunnel vision. When this occurs, the person's field of vision narrows, focusing on one point, while everything else is essentially blacked out. Today, the prosecution is experiencing their own special kind of tunnel vision. So distracted, committed to the idea of Lee's guilt, that they have refused to see in full the facts and evidence presented here at trial today, Your Honors. Your Honors, the prosecution has claimed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Lee is guilty of reckless burning, abandoning a fire, and causing catastrophe. But these things are simply impossible, and certainly not true. And as you take a look not just at the prosecution's case, but the surrounding circumstances they have chosen to overlook, you'll see that these have not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. First, in order for the prosecution to prove their claims of recklessness, they must prove that Lee deviated grossly from the standard of care that a reasonable person would exercise. Now, the prosecution has attempted to use Kennedy Price as an example of a reasonable person to whom his actions should have been more closely aligned, but you've heard from Kennedy Price herself that she is specifically bothered by fire. In this process, they've ignored every other person present at the party that took no issue with the fire. Lee Morgan Hatch, Brett Anderson, and Kennedy Price herself all testified that, in the end, she was really the only one concerned. Now, the prosecution has also attempted to prove that Lee Morgan Hatch did what he did recklessly and knowingly. We know he didn't do it recklessly because several other people were having campfires that evening. Thus, he never deviated, even in a minor way, from the standard of care that every other reasonable person was exercising that evening. And secondly, we know that he didn't do this knowingly because based off of all the things that Hatch knew, his actions were perfectly legal and perfectly safe. Based off of all the testimony you've heard today, you'll see that Hatch did not act recklessly, and he knew that what he was doing was completely safe. That takes care of the prosecution's prop they've left right there. But let's move on beyond that. The prosecution has also attempted to prove that Lee Morgan Hatch abandoned his fire, but this is simply not true. We know this for two reasons. First, because you've heard Lee testify today that he never left his fire. He merely went to sleep to wait it out. And even if he had, according to legal authorities, in order to prove someone is guilty of abandoning a fire, they must prove that he left without any intention of ever returning. And there's been no evidence brought forth to suggest that that is the case today. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, Your Honors, Lee Morgan Hatch has been accused of causing a catastrophe. Now, there is no doubt that the fire that swept through Elk Creek State Park caused a catastrophe. The question we have to answer today, Your Honors, is who caused that fire? Now, the prosecution would have you believe that by some unfortunate miracle, a single spark lifted up from Hatch's fire, traveled over his green grassy property and trees, across the railroad tracks, then still traveling a bit while remaining hot enough, settled down on a dry enough piece of land to set off an enormous wildfire. A scenario which you've heard from Ryan Finau is completely unreasonable, if not impossible, based off the surrounding circumstances, the wind, the distance, and the other evidence presented. Today, Your Honors, the prosecution holds the burden of proof. This means that they must prove beyond a reasonable doubt, or in other words, that no other logical explanation or reasonable alternative can be drawn from the facts and evidence presented at court, then that Lee Morgan Hatch is guilty of these crimes. And as you've seen today, there's a plethora of other reasonable alternate causes for the Elk Creek State Park fire. You've heard from Chris Hernandez that several other people were having campfires that day. If we're to believe that Lee Morgan Hatch's campfire could have solved the spark that started this wildfire, we have to believe that any of those other campfires could have done it as well. It's even possible that no single person is guilty of starting this fire, as you've heard that there were storm conditions found in the area on May 28th, and that dry lightning is not an unlikely cause of wildfires in this area. You've heard from Chris Hernandez that locals like Louis Hernandez will regularly break regulation, setting off fireworks and dangerous other combustible materials, and you've heard from Brett Anderson that those things were happening on the night of May 28th. You've also heard that kids like Dirk Miller will often hang around the railroad tracks, lighting things on fire just for fun, and beer cans were found under the trestle, suggesting the presence of irresponsible teens that night. Your Honor, the prosecution has had their own special kind of tunnel vision. They are aware of the facts and evidence presented today. They just don't care. If anything, Your Honors, this trial has done nothing but add confusion to this case, and confusion is not beyond a reasonable doubt. For those reasons, Your Honor, we would ask you to find Lee Morgan Hatch not guilty of all the charges in this case, because there's simply no way to prove beyond reasonable doubt that this single spark started this catastrophe, this wildfire. There are far too many reasonable alternatives in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Phelps. Mr. Christensen?
Yes, Your Honor.
Your rebuttal time?
May I confer with my bailiff on that?
Yes, you may.
About 40 seconds.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may proceed, sir.
Your Honor, the defense talked about tunnel vision. They talked about how it blinded us from seeing the facts as they really were. They talked about how it blinded us from answering any questions about this case. But Your Honor, the defense's own tunnel vision kept them from answering those three questions. But Your Honor, the prosecution has an answer to those three simple questions. Mr. Hatch knew, he just didn't care. But their tunnel vision kept them from recognizing much more. It kept them from recognizing that Mr. Hatch had 3 previous offenses for burning.
Time.
Your Honors. Solicitor Bureau.
Thank you, Mr. Christensen. At this time, we thank all the participants in this mock trial. We will be tied for about 5, let's say 7 minutes, so that we can deliberate based on the evidence that's been presented. We'll return and render our verdict and then give you our various commentaries. At this time, all the participants are relieved of the mock trial rules. You're welcome to converse with your supporters and your colleagues and cohorts. And also, we'd like the bailiffs to please retire with us so we can verify time and usage. Thank you.
All right.